Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of this DEI in Curling Summit. I'm Sarah Carlson from the Global Initiative of DEI in Curling, and with me is one of our co-founders, PN Raju. And we formed this initiative with the purpose of sharing resources and knowledge between curling organizations who want to make curling a more inclusive space. And this next webinar really has the potential to fill this purpose. We have with us Simon Barrick, who is assistant professor at Cape Breton University. And sorry, Simon, I messed up that name, didn't I?
That's okay, close.
Close. He's going to talk to us about structures of sport, as well as give us some tangible examples of things that we can change within our curling organizations. So if you are watching and you have comments or questions, you can just write them in the comment section of whatever platform you're using, and we will see them, and Simon will have time to answer them after his presentation. So now I would like to welcome you, Simon, to take over the screen.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Just give me a moment to get this settled, everyone. Can you see that screen all right, Sarah?
I see it just fine.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you again, and I am so pleased to be here with you all today, speaking about a topic that's near and dear to myself, which is inclusion in curling. However, though, today's presentation could also be called Curling Structures 101. What the heck are they? And more importantly, how do we change them for the better? I want to start off by making 3 acknowledgements. And first, I acknowledge that I'm coming to you all from beautiful Unama'ki, or Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada, which is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, with which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. I also want to thank Sarah and Raju and everybody else who has been pulling this great summit together and for inviting me to be a part of it. And I also want to have a special shout out to everybody who is participating in the summit, or perhaps who is listening to a recording down the road. And I really thank you for prioritizing and likely continuing to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion in curling. Now, I'm going to be speaking about 3 main things today and then leading into a discussion. I'm going to start off by speaking a bit about what curling structures are out there and how they relate to one another. I'm going to then go a little bit aspirational and talk about how we can maybe reimagine what these curling structures look like and what their roles can be in our sport and in society more largely. And then I also want to offer some tangible recommendations that people can begin to implement right away. And in this presentation, as I was forming it and speaking with Sarah about the topic, about what the needs of the attendees had been in the past and the interests, we came to 2 main questions. The first one being, how are curling organizations structured, and how do we make change within these curling structures? But I did want to provide a little bit of a background just so you can understand where I'm coming from within this topic. Curling, in short, is a huge part of my life. I've been a former competitive curler, longtime recreational curler, instructor, and coach. And over the last 9 years, I have been honing my craft as a social researcher, using curling as a primary focus of several of my research projects. And beyond the sport, I identify as a white, cisgender male, and I strive to use this privilege that I've experienced to be an ally or co-conspirator for making sports, especially curling, more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and just overall more welcoming. And when we think about curling structures, I always like to think of this as a curling ecosystem. And I also want to make a caveat here that there are always exceptions to any rule. And a lot of what I'll be speaking about today is focusing on general trends within curling. As well, many of the examples will come from Canadian and US contexts, because that is what I know best and where much of my research has been situated. But I also expect that many of the general topics discussed today will have at least some applicability across contexts, whether that be throughout the rest of the Americas, Europe, Africa, or the Middle East or Asia, as curling continues to grow globally. And the list I'm going to talk about now is in no way meant to be an exhaustive list, but rather some of the main structures we should consider. And when we think about these structures, and in the graphic you can see on the screen here, at the bottom is the curling club. And much of what I'll be talking about today, much like the panel that preceded my conversation, that I am so honored to be following and really enjoyed hearing from Sarah, Sabina, Richard, and Heather, really focuses in on that curling club. But then we also have regional organizations, national organizations, and global organizations. And there's also ancillary partners that really play a strong role within curling and the structures that operate within the sport. And these include broadcasters, sponsors, apparel companies, and change agents, of which I am particularly excited to talk about in a few minutes. And when we start with curling clubs, it's important to understand that there are a few main structures that all or almost all curling clubs have. And the first one is some form of a board or a board of directors. And this is a leadership body that is typically a collection of volunteers who are either appointed or elected. And their primary responsibilities primary roles include big picture responsibilities like strategic planning and setting and enforcing policies that the club will then operate by. The second category that I want to talk about is the operations staff. And the operations staff tend to be paid employees tasked with managing the specific day-to-day operations and executing the priorities and policies that are set by the board. Now, this is a case where not every club has an operational staff. And I'm currently located in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and the curling club that I play at is the Sydney Curling Club that currently does not have any paid staff in their organization. So not only their board of directors is volunteer run, but their ice staff, their bar staff, the event, anybody when they run at events, they are all volunteers who are working together for the central purpose or the same purpose of the club. So I really want to highlight that in many cases, operational staff are present and are important, but they're not the same, or they're not in existence in every club. And of course, what every club does have, no matter the size or the context, is volunteers. And I don't think I have to tell you all that volunteers really are the lifeblood of curling clubs. And volunteer support and management could be a whole nother webinar topic that I could discuss. But for now, it's important to understand that volunteers both or factor substantially into the structures within a curling club. And we can't forget as well that the most important part of any curling facility is in fact the curlers. So curlers come from all sorts of backgrounds and identities. And a main goal of my work, and I'm excited about on this initiative as well, is to make curling more welcoming and accessible for everyone in our communities. So let's shift over then to regional organizations. And when we think about regional organizations, these tend to be a catch-all term for city, regional, provincial, state, and or maybe territorial body that oversees the sport within a particular geographic context. And the scope tends to be bigger than a club or an individual community, but smaller than a country. So examples might include, in the Canadian context, the Toronto Curling Association and the Ottawa Valley Curling Association are two regional bodies that either are responsible for a large metropolitan area or a particular geographic region. In the case of Ottawa Valley, you've also got a territorial association like Curl Yukon, provincial associations like Curl Ontario or Curl Nova Scotia. In other countries, you might have, to take the United States, an example of the Grand National Curling Club that is responsible for curling facilities largely in the eastern part of the United States. And what's important to note is the purpose of these clubs involves maintaining and growing curling within their jurisdiction. And there are a number of priorities that these organizations will hold, two of the main ones being high performance curling, both development and maintenance, as well as grassroots or curling club development. And in some ways, similarly to the curling club, whoops, sorry about that, everyone. I will just reshare my screen. That'll teach me to press a button while presenting. All right. So the structures are very similar to curling clubs in that you have a board of directors, which again typically is a volunteer board, people with particular areas of expertise that can support the strategic planning, the visioning, the policy making of the sport in that particular jurisdiction, and as well as the operations staff, such as an executive director, competitions director, media director, and various working groups that tend to be overseen by one of these organizations or by one of these directors, one of these leadership positions, but might involve volunteers from individual curling clubs, stakeholders from different parts of the sport of curling, or outside of curling. And an important caveat here, much like the comment I made on the previous slide, is that some countries do not have regional entities that work behind the national and the curling club level. And this is especially the case in smaller curling nations or nations where the sport is fairly new. And the curling, in those cases, the curling clubs and the national organizations that I'll speak about in a moment work directly together. So when we think then, going up one step further, we go from regional now to national organizations. As you can imagine, these are organizations that are responsible for maintaining and growing curling within a national jurisdiction. So the Swedish Curling Association, Curling Canada would be two such examples. And a main priority or main dual priorities for this organization also involve high performance and grassroots curling development. And what's interesting in this case, and this is a topic that definitely was touched on in the past, in the previous panel, is that there's arguably an imbalance that exists between how much human and financial resources these national organizations devote towards high performance curling instead of curling club development. And one way that we can maybe think about this and maybe think about that imbalance between high performance curling and grassroots curling club development is where the revenue sources come from. So in a lot of national curling or national sport organizations, the funding comes, a big amount of their funding comes from the federal or the national governments, in large part to develop elite athletes, elite teams in this case, to represent the country at the Olympic Games, Paralympic Games, World Championships, and other such international competitions. So that revenue source is coming down, and it's tied to the quality of the performances that those athletes perform, that they finish with. And the second piece is revenue from high performance events that happen, that are hosted by many of these national organizations. And if we look at a sport like Curling Canada, whether you're in Canada or not, you probably have heard of the Brier, which is the National Men's Curling Championship, the Scotties, which is the Women's National Curling Championship, or the Olympic Trials, which generate huge television revenues, spectating revenues from ticket sales, sponsorships, that a lot of that money can go into help with the operating funds for these sports, for these national organizations. So therefore, they have a vested interest in devoting resources, devoting staff to making sure these events and these high performance teams are excelling to the highest degree. And there are two main structures. You'll start to see some repetition, especially with the regional organizations, that there is a board of directors that operates similarly to what it would be at the regional level, in that there are volunteer directors that typically either are recruited or are elected based on having particular skill sets that are advantageous to the national organization. And then the operations staff looks similar to regional organizations. They might have roles such as the chief executive officer, high performance director, finance officer, philanthropy director, and other type roles. As well, the third piece is also on these boards is association members. So these are, in the Canadian context, provincial and territorial organizations that have representation and voting responsibilities when Curling Canada, in this case, or national organization, will try to approve policies for the development of the sport. So you'll definitely see every year there'll be a Congress that'll come together, and again, this is in the Canadian context, and representatives from the provincial and territorial organizations will each have one vote in order to shape the future direction of the priorities of an organization such as Curling Canada. And as I kind of mentioned, that high performance versus grassroots divide is in large part reflective of where the revenue generation sources currently are within a sport organization. And that it's, whereas having a strong grassroots participation is helpful for the health of the sport, it doesn't always translate into seeing year-to-year revenue increases at, say, a regional or a national organization, and hence why maybe these pieces don't quite get the energy or the attention that they deserve. But we are seeing, and some of this was alluded to earlier, that there is an evolution in how national organizations are operating, what they're prioritizing, with the rise of safe sport considerations and making sure the sports are free or are trying to reduce sport-related injuries, abuse and violence and discrimination within sports spaces, and then also increasingly looking at a focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and extending out to indigenization and decolonization. And while especially from a DEI perspective, we aren't necessarily seeing, say, in Curling Canada, people being hired yet explicitly to focus on these roles, we are seeing cases where there are concerted efforts to develop working groups to try and recruit individuals to the board of directors that have experience and have interests in developing diversity, equity, inclusion throughout the sport. So there is progress. It's just slower than probably many of us would like. And then moving over to the global organizations, the purpose here really is to focus on worldwide promotion and development. And the priorities from the most recent World Curling Federation strategic plan, which is the global organization, the main international or global organization that oversees the sport of curling, is organizational sustainability, engagement with trying to expand engagement across diverse stakeholders, development, and competitions. And some of the main structures that we'll see in an organization of the World Curling Federation are things such as the annual assembly, which is where member associations, so each nation that belongs to the World Curling Federation, much like the example I brought up in the Canadian context, will have a vote and will have a say then in the direction of the policies and the strategic planning of this organization, and by extension, the sport moving forward. Competition rules are also something that falls under the purview of the World Curling Federation. There's also a board of directors, and this has very clear regional representation in that there's a president and then various vice presidents that represent each of the major regions, whether that's the Americas, Europe, or Asia as well. So there is that representation across the globe. And then there are, of course, various staff people that have in many cases, director roles that are responsible for specific portfolios within the organization, as well as overseeing specific commissions. And just for some examples here, I pulled these materials off of the most recent publications that have come out of the World Curling Federation. So this is the organizational structure, and you'll see at the top the annual assembly and the board, and then it'll work down to the various commissions that the staff definitely play a role in, but that also are filled by people from, say, the various national organizational bodies and also additional key stakeholders within the sport. And then shifting over to the staffing structure, so you can get a visual idea of it, you can see how there's senior leaders kind of at the top of the graphic, and then you can work left to right from head of broadcast, head of development, head of media, and other roles, finance roles, that all play an important role within the organization. So this hopefully sheds a bit of light on how an organization like the World Curling Federation will organize itself, and how it will prioritize what aspects, what roles, what procedures it does. And then I do want to touch for a moment on the relationships across these structures, because it is important when you think about whether the curling club, all the way up to these global structures, to think about how they fit together. And as you probably could see, there definitely are some similarities in that similar organizational designs. And one thing that is a commonality is these formal organizations tend to be organized by jurisdiction, maybe in a local community, region, nation, or responsible for the sport internationally. However, there are also strong connections across these bodies, and one of which is revenue and funding. And I should say strong interconnectedness, or at least some interconnectedness, in that revenues are accumulated in many national contexts, Canada being an example, where the curling clubs pay dues both to their respective regional organization and their national organization. So funding goes up as well. So it's not just funding from major events that the national organization holds or federal government funding that they receive, but they also get bottom up money through those forms. And these organizations, whether they're international, national, or regional organizations, do download resources, financial resources, in the form of funding through grants, through emergency awards or emergency bursaries that an organization like Curling Canada might give to curling clubs that encounter an emergency capital expenditure that they hadn't budgeted for. And there's different ways that these different levels all work together. And as well, as I mentioned, decision-making also plays a role in that national organizations are members of the World Curling Federation Annual Assembly, and provincial associations also sit as member associations at the Curling Canada decision-making level. So there's all these different interconnections and all these different ways that curling bodies, curling organizations can influence one another. However, there are also examples where maybe the connections are not so strong. And I just want to speak for a moment on some of the connection, and particularly on the connection between Curling Canada and the various curling clubs that exist throughout the country. So in Canada, curling clubs are independent from Curling Canada despite paying dues to the national organization. And that by extension means that Curling Canada has limited influence over curling clubs, in that curling is not maybe a franchise model where clubs are franchises or franchisees of Curling Canada. So there is a certain amount of independence. Curling Canada is a somewhat independent organization. The various regional organizations throughout the country have a certain amount of independence, and the curling clubs have a certain amount of independence from one another. And as you can imagine, this creates some advantages and disadvantages, both for the system and for the individual stakeholders, the individual clubs, the individual organizations. But there also are some national contexts that do have greater control over their clubs. And there are ways I've been learning that, say, national organizations are trying to maybe ensure that curling clubs are prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion from doing such things as awarding grants, so awarding finances for various program development or training resources, but having certain requirements that curling clubs and the people that are doing this work need to follow in order to receive that money. And it is important to speak about the role that various ancillary partners play within the sport. And broadcasters play an integral role both in sharing the sport, both in broadcasting the sport literally or helping expand the reach of the sport to different individuals, different regions of the world, different potential participants. And you've got broadcasters such as TSN and Sportsnet in Canada. You've got the National Broadcasting Corporation, or NBC, in the United States, Eurosport, China Central Television, and many others, as well as the rise of digital platforms. So these are, some of these sources like TSN or NBC using, sharing their content through digital platforms, but also digital-only platforms. And for those of you that have maybe been watching curling this season, the rise of curling.com, which is trying to fill a gap in providing coverage of events, say from regional tour events or events that maybe aren't in arenas that get that major national television or international television casting. So these are very important roles in influencing and in some cases maintaining the structures that we have within our sport. Apparel companies also play a role, whether that's outfits like Goldline, Balance Plus, Asham, and Hardline, as well as the multitude of sponsors that provide financial remuneration or financial support to organizations, mainly to host events, but also just to have their name associated with the sport of curling. So Tim Hortons in Canada, Le Gruyere in Europe, as well as LGT Bank as well, are some examples. And then the last example that I want to speak about is something that is really becoming a more recent phenomenon in curling, which is the role of what I'm calling change agents, that are specific, focused organizations that are trying to achieve particular purposes, and in this case, from diversity, equity, and inclusion perspectives, mainly. And they're largely grassroots in nature, and in part because they're new, they're still developing their structures. So they don't have as entrenched structures or as hierarchies as some of the organizations that I spoke about previously. So examples on the screen, you're attending a webinar of one of these such change agents, Global Initiative for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Curling, the Curler Outreach Program, United We Curl, which we heard a lot about in the previous webinar, Icebreakers, which is an American-based initiative to try to amplify the sport for BIPOC individuals, and the BlackRock Initiative, based here in Canada, specifically in Nova Scotia, being led mainly by Andrew Barris, and trying to grow the sport and to hashtag change the face of curling, and the people that can enter the sport and making it far more welcoming for a wider range of people, but also hopefully over time creating social change or cultural change within our sport that many people would agree is long overdue. And then returning back to the curling club, I wanted to speak for a few minutes about membership. And in short, membership is where curlers pay fees to join a club or league. And I'm really glad Heather brought this up in the past webinar or in the past, in the panel discussion that happened, is that generally for a long time in curling's history, these were one-time payments at the start of the season where everybody paid the same amount of money, and it was very much everybody really had the same experience in this space, and there really wasn't a lot of flexibility or innovation built in. And in some ways, it does make operational sense for curling clubs to build up a large amount of revenue near the start of your season to kind of help you budget and to ensure that there's enough revenue both for any major capital expenses, but also to ensure that you can at least have a sizable amount of your budget built in near the start. However, what we're also seeing is that there are some diverse membership structures emerging, and a few of them were mentioned previously, again in the last webinar, whether it might be half year or breaking the curling season into thirds, so 1/3, 2/3, and 3, and then the final third, where you could pay for one or all of those mechanisms to provide greater flexibility for people that, at least pre-COVID, would travel, maybe go to a warmer climate in the second half of the winter, or different pieces like that. And so we're starting to see a rise in prominence in these cases. So what you might also see is discounted memberships for people from particular backgrounds, ages, or maybe newer curlers as well, giving them a discounted membership to try to relieve some of the barriers and some of the hesitation to join the sport. But some limitations about how membership has been done in the sport of curling is, and I'm really picking up on the points that Richard and others were saying previously, is that membership is really in some ways a closed, exclusive, and some would argue outdated system. There's a certain amount of inaccessibility to it, either actual inaccessibility if you're not a member, or perceived inaccessibility if you think, curling club, it sounds private, it sounds exclusive, probably not for me, or I don't know how to go in. And as well, the past membership structures have been particularly rigid. And on a similar vein, when we look at leagues, these are the common way that competition is structured within curling clubs. And this tends to be a set structure. So you would play Monday nights, and that league would have particular inclusion or exclusion criteria. So it might be Monday night curling at your club is a women's league. Tuesday night is a men's league. Wednesday night is a mixed league. So two athletes from either male and of male and female backgrounds, maybe a junior or youth league, and some other variations. But definitely these are fairly rigid in nature. But a benefit of that is that it can build a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And that also can't be underappreciated. Some of my research looking at adult learn to curl leagues, there was interesting conversations about how in some cases curlers who had just started in the sport were communicating that they had a strong sense of belonging to the league they were a part of, but also the curling club after maybe only a few weeks or a couple months within the sport, which I thought was a particularly interesting finding that shouldn't be lost in this discussion. But just like membership, some limitations emerge in terms of it being closed, exclusive system that can be particularly inaccessible and rigid, especially when it is the only options that curling clubs have. Definitely things are changing as well with leagues that I'll revisit in a moment, but that definitely is an important reality to keep in mind. And when we think about trends within our sport, and trends looking at structures, particularly within curling, many of these structures are long-standing. And I suspect that everybody that's listening, or almost everybody that's listening to this webinar, will have heard some variation of, we've always done it this way, either explicitly or when a new idea or questioning about how maybe an organization, particularly a curling club, moves forward or addresses a problem. Definitely there is some resistance to change across sport, and curling is one example. As well, there are very much organizational commonalities or similarities, a focus on administration, high performance, And marketing and promotion over grassroots development means that, especially from the curling club perspective, many folks maybe feel that these regional, national, and international organizations in particular haven't been serving their needs and aren't necessarily designed, perhaps, to best serve the needs of individual curling clubs and individuals within the sport without some kind of substantial change. As well, jurisdictional pressures, meaning that since there are external forces at play, meaning the increasing competition, the decreasing amount of funding and resources that people have access to, it means that organizations really need to go into crisis management or risk management types of procedures. And this can sometimes lead to conflict across jurisdictions when the autonomy, for example, of a curling club or curling clubs feel like that they feel that it's being threatened by maybe perceived overreach from a regional organization or a national organization. And there have been many cases, even just in the Canadian context, where we see some of these tensions playing out. It can be really hard to create, sustained system change or do things such as promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want to spend a few minutes here before we go to the discussion, just speaking about a few ways that we can reimagine curling structures. So this is definitely thinking big picture and aspirational over time. As Sarah kind of mentioned before, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. First one is curling clubs as community hubs, curling organizations as collaborative incubators, and I'll talk about what that means, overhauling membership and league models, and flattening hierarchies. So when we think about curling clubs, as community hubs, I'm really thinking in this space of a transition from a sport-specific center that is focused around curling and curling participation to what would it look like if it was more communal and based, it was more communal, social hubs of activity where you were really meant not just bringing members of the curling community together, but members of your community. And I think in this way about if you have multi-sport or recreational centers in your community, and you go to maybe the public spaces, the front lobby, some of the sitting or spectating areas, these facilities, this tends to be a beehive of activity where people from all different types of backgrounds, all different types of identities are coexisting together, in many cases interacting with one another, and hopefully in its best form, creating some positive interactions and a positive sense of community. And this would transition curling clubs from this perception of being a closed space to that being of an open, welcoming space. That would be further, I would argue, sustained by changing a number of pieces, such as changing the name. A conversation that's been going on for a fairly long period of time now is changing from curling clubs to curling centers, as well as the physical changing of what the curling clubs look like, thinking about how maybe they could either be modernized or you can create spaces that are accessible in all forms and welcoming to people, that people will want to come into. People can see that they're visible in public space and people will want to come to. Programming that also attracts people in, and also might be the hardest one to adjust and change because it will take time, is changing the image of curling. There definitely is a perception among many people, definitely curlers, that curling's a democratic, welcoming, inclusive sport. But as we're learning, especially in these conversations of DEI, that attitude and that belief isn't held by everyone. And it's important to recognize that and try to move forward. When we think about curling organizations as collaborative incubators, I pose the question of what if curling organizations placed collaboration and openness at the center of their culture? And I take the example from my research, my current research really focuses on the role that sport participation plays for immigrants or newcomers to Canada. And when we look at immigrant serving organizations, they, in part out of necessity, have had to be very collaborative, very partner-driven in creating partnerships with all kinds of entities, whether it's in education, economic settings, business settings, cultural settings, and sports settings to really drive the expansion of their programming, because there's only so many resources and so much capacity that these organizations have. So what could maybe curling take from looking at a model like that to be truly collaborative and centering collaboration? As well, many clubs are standalone facilities, and because of that, meaning that maybe they're not in a multi-sport community center. I know this is changing in lots of contexts, but for those standalone facilities, there are some even just geographic or spatial challenges to becoming welcoming, to be opening your doors to different or broader audiences. And then when we think about collaborations, I've talked about this in other conversations in the curling world, relationships are absolutely essential in DEI work. So when we think also about changing membership and league models, what alternative membership or program approaches exist? Talked about partial season or discounted membership, pay per use, or providing a sets of tickets to take similar to maybe a golf approach, where you could maybe purchase a set of green fees for a reduced rate, a set of tickets that you could take, 5 or 10 tickets. So it's not the same commitment that traditionally we've expected of people, but people could still engage and really satisfy maybe that interest or that wanting to participate and to try the sport over multiple times. Drop-in or convenience participation, maybe a space where the ice is purposely left free and people can come in, have a beverage, socialize with one another in your lounge space, do some other activities. I know, for example, to go back to my local example here, the Sydney Curling Club, they host trivia nights. And these can be great examples to bring curlers in, people that are already members of the club, but also members of the local community that maybe never will curl, don't want to curl, but at least it's bringing folks into this space and really maybe changing in some ways the purposes of that space. And thinking about building new curler retention. So what roles do the ever increasing learn to curl leagues or novice programs such as under 5 leagues, so meaning leagues for people with only a certain number of years of experience, what roles can they play? And going back to this gap that I've kind of identified, and I think many of us have heard of or have felt or experienced from time to time, that perceived and or real gap between curling clubs and those regional, national, and international organizations. And how do we address this gap? Well, one way is, instead of thinking about in terms of a hierarchy with the international organization being so far away from the curling center, and I've changed the name here purposefully in the graphic, but thinking about how all these different organizations, all these different entities work together to support curling, and restructuring and working to restructure organizations to focus more purposefully on curling club development, otherwise placing curling clubs at the center of this. And while this requires sizable adjustments in funding and staffing models, so say what staffing roles some of these organizations have, it is absolutely possible. Now, to close, I want to move from maybe a little bit more aspirational and a little bit harder to see how this could be a direct impact in a month, 6 months, 5 years, whatever it might be, to thinking about some specific recommendations centered around how do we create change both within the structures of curling and to the structures that we have within our sport. To start, I think it's important to keep doing what you're doing just now in listening, learning, and growing, attending webinars like this, engaging with content that's also outside the sport of curling, in other sport contexts, or even just general diversity, equity, and inclusion content is very helpful. Engage in one way or another, and a main way this can be done is through volunteering. Volunteering or continue to volunteer at your curling club level, creating a collaboration or partnership between your curling club and maybe an entity in your local community, looking at calls for the board of directors at maybe a regional or even your national curling organization, and continue to advocate for diversity, equity, inclusion being a primary importance for curling organizations moving forward. On whether you're volunteering or whether you're staying as a curler, as a fan, as a competitive player, whatever it might be, any combination of those, continue to hold the people in power accountable, making sure that they are advocating for the curling future that you want. When opportunities come up to vote or to recommend people for board positions, make sure you're thinking carefully about the types of people that should be in these spaces and should be hopefully pushing forward on some meaningful change. Push back against the status quo wherever possible. And as well, think about how you can build networks, with people, say through an organization or entity like this global initiative in DEI, or other collaborations in your community or maybe in your national context. And don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. Really think about how you can utilize existing resources, programs, training materials, and services to bring them forward in the sport of curling to make meaningful change. And to end, I really want you to think about when we're moving into the DEI space, and whether you already have been working in this space for a period of time, is to think about, with moving forward or how to get started, the power of one. Just starting with something, starting with doing a training, starting with bringing something to your curling club's board of directors, starting with reaching out and going for a coffee with somebody from a local organization that you think would be a really good fit with your curling club, or any other of many different approaches you could take. And I can assure you that in these cases, people will come on board, and likely a snowball effect will follow, leading to that really meaningful change that we all hope for. Here are some different selected resources that you all can look back on after the presentation. I want to sincerely thank everybody for participating and listening, and I would love to have a bit of discussion about your reactions to what I shared for the past while. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Simon, for a lot of information in those 45 minutes. That I think we all got some really tangible stuff to take away. We do have a question from our previous panelist, Sabina. Hi, Simon. Just wondering how you feel about funding that comes from governments, i.e. Sport Canada, not flowing to NSOs unless they meet certain DEI benchmarks. If they can't meet the benchmarks or are unwilling to do so, feed some funding to the grassroots organizations who are willing to do the work.
Yes, wouldn't that be the dream for sure? I think it's a really intriguing idea, and I honestly think that we're not too far away from that, where Sport Canada, I see the day where Sport Canada may put some stricter restrictions on organizations, saying maybe they need staff that are devoted to thinking about DEI, or they need to build in specific plans into their policies in order to get that yearly funding or specialized funding to do this work. So I think that there would be some challenges with that, and I think there would be some pushback, because anytime you have an organization in a power position exerting influence over organizations, in this case Sport Canada, down to a national sport organization and so on, that could definitely create some tensions and some politicking about how that plays out. But I see that as one way that we can move towards meaningful DEI change. So in part, top down, absolutely, there's a place for that, where top down change is being implemented. But I'd also argue there's no substitute for that bottom up development, where people are organizing, collecting, like we're seeing in the sport, but also on an individual level, are going to your curling clubs and are demanding change. I'm always hearing from curling clubs that are thinking about working in or want to begin to learn, whether it's at a board level, a junior program level, whatever it might be, thinking about, what is inclusion, or what is equity, or whatever else that might be. So change is underfoot, And I think, Sabina, you should continue to beat that drum and get that idea moving forward for Up to Sport Canada and other such bodies.
And I mean, you and I have talked about this before, Simon, when I asked you the question, and you've had some time to think about it now. So I'm going to ask it again. So if you were given freely, like no limitations, just this is your own, you get to design the curling rink, and you get to start the curling club, the curling center. What do you think your main areas of focus would be? Like, how would you build it?
Where my mind first went is that openness, is that opening, welcoming environment. So it really starts at, what the facility looks like from the outside, where it's located, what it's located in proximity to. Curling clubs, I think, have a history in many cases of being built, kind of in a corner somewhere around a building or in a busy part of a community, or in a way that you might not know it's a curling club or a curling center. So I think definitely focusing on the outside, and focusing on what it looks like to come up to that facility and to go into that facility, I think is truly important if we want to change and make, say, curling a welcoming sport, and what I argue is a cultural and social and community hub that curling is absolutely perfectly positioned to be. And we're just like resistant to kind of make some of these hard choices or prioritize that moving forward. So I would say that's probably where I would start. I'd have a long laundry list after that, but that'd be first.
Okay, whenever you get to publishing that list, I think we'll be happy to share it.
Yeah, if I can just find the money for it too, then we're really in business.
Don't think we have any other questions coming in right now. So if anyone's really quick in writing them, we will attend to them. But if not, then I really want to thank you, Simon, for taking your time and preparing and presenting this for us.
My pleasure, Sarah. And I echo from what I said at the beginning that I think it's wonderful the work you, Raju, and other folks that are involved in this organization are doing. I think it serves an invaluable need that is already making a substantial impact, and I'm just happy to play a small role in it today.
Thank you. And we have Monica here saying thank you as well. Also a co-founder of the Global Initiative. So this means now for all of you watching that we have just over a half an hour break before the youth panel comes on. We have a mix of Swedish and Canadian youth who are all really dedicating their time to develop the sport of curling. So we are going to hear them talk about the topics that they think is most important, and also what it's like to engage in sport in your junior years. So please join us again in, what is it, 37 minutes, just good enough time to have a little break, move around and get some snacks, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.